Muy buenos días. En primer lugar, muchísimas gracias por su presencia. Yo les felicito porque ustedes han escogido un curso que yo creo que merece la pena. Los demás dirían lo mismo, pero me parece a mí que pensar en la guerra en el siglo XXI probablemente es uno de los temas de mayor interés, de mayor actualidad, de mayor preocupación que podemos tener hoy en el mundo actual. Yo quiero por ello primero felicitar a Diego Martínez, que ha coordinado este acto, este curso de verano. Es imposible desarrollar mejor una estructura como la ha hecho Diego, y por eso yo quiero darle singularmente las gracias. Yo creo que el desorden que vive el mundo occidental es el preámbulo de las guerras. El desorden nunca culmina en el extremo desorden. El extremo desorden culmina en la violencia. Eso nos dice la Segunda Guerra Mundial, cuando hubo una falta de supremacía militar en aquellas fechas y se produjo la guerra, es decir, el desorden llevó la guerra. Y hoy también hay síntomas de que hay un extremo desorden en Europa, en Estados Unidos, en el mundo occidental. Se vive como un final de etapa de Occidente sin que sea el final de Occidente. Pero todo eso nos lleva a examinar la guerra como algo fundamental. El filósofo Remy Brague, que ha participado muchas veces en los actos que nosotros hacemos desde Neos, Remy Brague decía que la guerra por primera vez es una guerra que puede significar la autodestrucción del hombre. De ahí la diferencia de estas guerras con las anteriores, que en esta ocasión el hombre tiene una fuerza capaz de destruir el universo. De ahí el cuidado, la importancia, la necesidad de profundizar en el significado de la misma. Hoy nos acompaña probablemente una de las personalidades que mejor conocen el mundo. Lo conoce habiendo viajado en múltiples ocasiones por lugares en conflicto. Como analista, como un gran historiador. Es una de las voces más autorizadas que existen hoy en el mundo para inaugurar unas jornadas como esta. Yo quiero agradecer a Robert Kaplan la oportunidad que nos ha dado con su presencia en este acto inaugural de los cursos de verano. Así que sin más, Diego, no sé si quieres añadir, presentar y moderar el acto, así que tú tienes la palabra. Mr. Kaplan, thank you very much for your presence today in Escorial.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's really a great honor to be here. Many years ago, for the first time, I read Fernand Braudel's book, The Mediterranean and the Mediterranean World in the Age of Philip II, and it had a great effect on me. And I got very interested in Philip II, and of course, and in geopolitics, which is what Braudel was really writing about the 16th century Mediterranean. So to be here next to the Escorial, built by Philip II, is really a great honor. What I'm going to try to do this morning is take you through the world as I see it. You know, what is behind the headlines, or, you know, what's missed in the headlines. Let me start this way. Technology has not defeated geography. What it has done, has shrunk geography. It's made our world smaller, more claustrophobic, more anxious. We're all on top of each other, and we're all stuck with each other in a way. The very limited size of the Earth has become a force for instability, because populations keep growing, even though world population will level off in 2080 or so. But populations keep growing, cities keep growing, and there's no room. There's what I call a crisis of room. And because of this, a geopolitical crisis in Asia can affect geopolitics or politics in Europe or North America as never before in history. The same with the Middle East and Europe. We've always been affected by things far away, but never so intensely as now. So that there's this feeling of a permanent crisis. There is always a crisis to pay attention to, and that is not accidental. It is deliberate. It's deliberate because of the way, as I said, technology has shrunk geography so that we're all on top of each other. When I look around for a metaphor, for a comparison of what this all means, I think back to the Weimar Republic of Germany between 1919 and 1933. Now, Weimar led to Hitler, but that's not what I'm interested in. What I'm interested in is the politics of Weimar before Hitler of those 15 years. And remember, the Weimar Constitution was drawn up by people, by lawyers and politicians in Germany, in central Germany, who wanted to avoid another very strong leader like Bismarck or Kaiser Wilhelm II. So they overlearned the lesson. They did their job too well, and they produced a system that nobody could govern. And so there was always a medium level of chaos throughout. And Weimar Germany sprawled from Western Europe to Eastern Europe, to what is now Belarus and Poland and places like that. So it was big, it was vast. And I see the world today as a vast geopolitical Weimar, in the sense that there's a permanent crisis. Nobody is in control, but everybody affects each other as never before. We have overlapping missile ranges, we have megacities, we have financial markets, we have vast urbanization, we have social media. We're all connected, which connects us even more so with each other. So if you're overwhelmed by the world and the Middle East and Ukraine and China, it's normal. We don't have a world government, but we have a world system. We do have a world system which we never had before, and which is what drives this permanent instability, this permanent crisis. I used the word claustrophobia to describe the world today. Warfare in the Middle East, in Asia, in Ukraine is not thousands of miles away, it's one click away, so to speak. The United States and China are one click away from each other. That's what destabilizes the relationship. Now, there's another concept I want you to keep in mind. It was ascribed to Vladimir Lenin, but Lenin never actually said it. Still, it's a very interesting concept. He said that decades could go along and nothing happens. But then days and weeks and months can go along and decades happen. This is crucial. Look, in Europe, for years, you had nothing happening. Yes, there was this paradigm that, yes, Putin was dangerous, he was a dictator, but we can get along with him. In the case of Eastern Europe and Germany, we can buy oil and natural gas from him. This idea this state of things went on for years and years and years. And then suddenly, in February 2022, decades started to happen, after decades where nothing happened, essentially. And since then, we have, we have war. Now, let me talk about Ukraine for a while, and then I'll go to the Middle East, and finally to China. World War I gave the 20th century its tragic direction. It did so because it went on for 4 long years, and 18 million people were killed. The Ukraine war is in its 4th year. Now, we don't read about it as much as we used to because the media demands novelty. It demands a new angle every day, or else the story drifts down from page 1 to page 2 to page 3. And there's been very little new developments in the Ukraine war, so we read less about it. But the intensity of the war continues just like it was 2 or 3.5 years ago. You've had many, many tens of thousands of troops on each side killed and wounded. You had thousands and thousands of tanks destroyed. It's the equivalent of World War I plus drones and cyber warfare, essentially. And the longer this war goes on, things will happen. The first thing is that the Russian Empire gets weaker and weaker. Yes, I know that Russia is winning for the moment in Ukraine. But if you step back and take a look at things, you will see that precisely because of the war that is all-consuming from Moscow and the regime in the Kremlin, Russia has less and less ability to affect the outcome in the Caucasus, in former Soviet Central Asia, in Siberia, and in the Russian Far East. So that the Russian Empire is slowly crumbling as the Ukraine war continues, and it's out of the news. Nobody writes about this. But this is the great big development. Now, there are all these republics in the Russian Federation that you may never have heard of, like Dagestan, Buryatia, Tuva, Chechnya. It's these republics that are supplying the manpower of Putin's army. There's relatively few ethnic Russians from Moscow and St. Petersburg being drafted into the army. And when this war is over, those republics will have a deep hatred for Russia. So that's what I mean when I say the Russian Empire is weakening, because this war is already in its 4th year. And there will be great repercussions to it. And just because you read about it less doesn't mean it is not as intense as it was when it first began. And what you need to use your imagination. Really, that's what I'm going to be concluding with, the whole idea of imagination. A lot of things happen in geopolitics that nobody can predict until they happen, essentially. And what could happen is, remember that Vladimir Putin has more power in the Kremlin than any Russian leader since Stalin. Because the later Soviet leaders, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Kosygin, Andropov, Gorbachev, they were part of what's called politburos of 12 or 14 men. It was a committee rule. Committees really ran the country. so that when one man made a mistake, somebody else could take charge. There was a coup against Khrushchev in 1964 because Khrushchev had miscalculated in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and so Brezhnev and Kosygin took over, and when the Russians miscalculated in Afghanistan, the whole empire collapsed. Now, this Politburo was composed of the most conservative men. Why do I say conservative, even though they were communists? Because they were all survivors of Stalin's purges. And how do you survive Stalin's purges? By having an opinion on nothing. By just never opening your mouth, always being suspicious. So the United States had a very stable situation in the Cold War. It was dealing with people who were officially communists, but who were really deeply, deeply conservative and who were risk averse. They were, they wanted to avoid risk at any point. Vladimir Putin is not like this at all. He's willing to take risks, and there's no Politburo or institution behind him. So that if he disappears, if he's overthrown, or he gets sick, or he dies, and eventually this will happen, there's no system there. So Russia could become a low-calorie version of the former Yugoslavia. Russia is not like China. China is deeply institutionalized. If Xi Jinping got sick tomorrow, the standing committee in Beijing would just elect a new leader. And things might change dramatically, of course, but there would not be instability like what is possible in Russia. So let me move on to the Middle East. Again, what is ascribed to Lenin: decades go along and nothing happens. Days and weeks and months go along and decades happen. For decades, nothing happened in the Middle East. Both the Israelis and the Saudis and others assumed that the Palestinian problem was going away. Then October 7th, 2023 happened, and decades started within days and weeks. And that's been continuing now for almost 2 years. That's the real phenomena. Now, when this process started, October 7th, Iran had a great proxy army in Lebanon, Hezbollah. It had a great proxy army in Gaza, Hamas. It had a great proxy army in northern Yemen, the Houthis. And the regime was protected internally by a vast nuclear weapons program. Now, how did this come about? It came about because of the Iran-Iraq War between 1980 and 1988. And the Iran-Iraq War was fought on Iranian soil, and this traumatized the new revolutionary regime. And the new revolutionary regime of Ayatollahs became determined that they would never ever have to fight in Iran itself. And that's what led to the creation of Hezbollah, of Hamas, of the Houthis in Yemen. The regime would fight abroad for its values, not internally in Iran. And nobody would touch the regime because it would build a nuclear weapons program. The one thing we know about nuclear weapons is that if you have them, nobody attacks you. North Korea has about 65 or 68 nuclear weapons. That's why the United States want to avoid a conflict with North Korea. Gaddafi gave up his weapons of mass destruction in Libya, and without them he was attacked and overthrown and killed. Ukraine gave up their nuclear weapons at the end of the Cold War, and Russia was able to invade. So the Ayatollahs determined they needed nuclear weapons so that nobody would dare invade Iran. You know, this is all logical from the regime's point of view. Well, October 7th happened. And October 7th, because it evoked the Holocaust in Europe, flipped a switch in the Israeli mind. A real switch where the Israelis became determined to get rid of Iran, essentially. Immediately on October 7th, the Israelis knew that Hamas, because remember, it wasn't just what Hamas did on October 7th. On October 8th, Hezbollah fired hundreds of missiles into northern Israel. People forget this. And 120,000 Israelis had to be evacuated. Leave their homes, be evacuated. Now, Israel's a country of under 10 million. Spain is a country of 44.5 million. So imagine if close to 1 million Spaniards had missiles fired on them and had to withdraw to another part of the country, what that would do to domestic politics in Spain. Think of it that way. So Israel is a democracy. Because it's a democracy, it has to defend its voters, essentially. So that's where Israel conceived that it's not just Hamas that is the problem. The problem is ultimately Iran. So that Israel methodically went about destroying Hezbollah, destroying Hamas, tremendously weakening the Houthis in northern Yemen, much more so than the U.S. Navy did. And then destroying Iran's air defense system and doing tremendous damage to its nuclear and missile program. And that's what allowed the Israelis to manipulate President Trump to bomb the nuclear sites, that were buried deep underground. All this was prefigured because of the ferocity of October 7th, because of the extreme violence of October 7th. Let me say a word about Prime Minister Netanyahu. In the world today, we have a lot of European prime ministers. We have a Secretary General of NATO who's a former Dutch prime minister. We've had American presidents Clinton, Obama, and Biden. And I can promise you that in 30 or 40 years, all of them will be forgotten, because they're all very forgettable figures when you think about it. They'll be writing big, thick books about Benjamin Netanyahu in 40 or 50 years. He's a world historical figure, like him or not. He has governed Israel longer than any leader in its history. He deals with levels of stress and anxiety that would immobilize the average European or American politician. He literally has to draw up lists of people he will assassinate on a weekly basis. He decides life and death. There is several criminal suits against him. He has to appear in court, and he deals with domestic politics, coalition politics, which are more ferocious and more extreme in Israel than they are in any place in Europe or the United States. And he manages, he just manages. And when you look at him, Putin, Xi Jinping, Donald Trump, these are world historical figures, maybe in a negative sense, but they will not be forgotten. They're leaving a mark on the world. And whereas the democratic world of Europe, the United States, Japan, and Asia have no figures to speak of who are larger than life or charismatic in any sense of the word. Now, people say, well, we have to find a solution to the Palestinian problem. Well, finding a solution to the Palestinian crisis is actually easy. Many political scientists have designed solutions. Coming up with a solution is the easy part. The hard part is the politics of it, which is why it never happened. Israeli troops left Gaza permanently in 2005, 20 years ago. Israeli settlers left Gaza permanently 20 years ago in 2005. For 18 years, between 2005 and the Israeli invasion of Gaza in 2023, Gaza was, in a practical, functional sense, independent. Now, imagine if Lee Kuan Yew, the late Prime Minister of Singapore, had gotten control of Gaza in 2005. Rather than building underground tunnels, he would have built a great port, and Gaza would have thrived and be rich, and Israel would have diplomatic relations with it and all of that. But that's not what happened. If I showed you a map of the West Bank, there would be big ink blots of Jewish settlements, which you cannot get rid of. The idea was to create facts on the ground, and they succeeded. So that there is really no territorial solution to the West Bank at this moment. So this crisis will go on, and it will probably go on until there is a new regime in Iran. Now, I've been talking about a new regime in Iran for 20 years now, and people said I was crazy. Now people say I'm less crazy, because with Iran losing Hezbollah, losing Hamas, losing the Houthis, and losing, for the most part, its nuclear weapons program, the regime is very weak, it's embattled. And again, we're talking about Persia. We're not talking about the Arab world. We're talking about 85 million highly educated, urbanized people who in the past experimented with constitutionalism during the late Qajar dynasty at the turn of the 20th century. Had the Shah stayed in power, Iran today would be a constitutional monarchy like Spain, and a Middle East version of South Korea in terms of economics. I remember when the Shah was in power. I'm 73 years old. And the Shah, when the Shah was in power, nobody could imagine an Iran without the Shah. He seemed eternal. And then one day, poof, he was gone. And a regime that nobody imagined came to power. And now, since the regime has been in power for 45 years, people cannot imagine a new regime. They think it is eternal. But it will pass someday. It may pass next week or next month or in 5 years or so. But this war and the destruction that I've described will have a devastating effect on the regime. And a future Iran could be a few different things. You could have a Revolutionary Guard regime which would be even more oppressive. Or you could have a traditional military republic without democracy, like in Egypt, like in Pakistan, or a place like that, that would not be at war with any of its neighbors, including Israel. You could have a democracy. That's possible too. Remember, democracy may have failed in several countries in the Arab world, but Iran is on a much higher political level. Remember, when the Shah fell, there was not chaos, like there was chaos in Syria or Libya or stuff. Immediately there was a new regime. So don't assume there would be chaos if this regime collapses, so to speak. You could also have a further regionalization of Iran, with Azeri Turkish in the northwest merging with Azerbaijan in the north, the Kurds and the Arabs getting regional autonomy, the Baluch in the southeast getting regional autonomy, the Turkomans in the north getting regional autonomy, etc. So Iran will be fascinating to watch, and the present is just a transition to something new, which could change. And so far, before I move on to Asia, let me say that the big winners of this war between Israel and Iran is Saudi Arabia. They're the big winners, because this frees up Saudi Arabia to move closer to Israel, because it's not like the Saudis and the Gulf Arabs love the Israelis. It's that they have less trust in the United States. They care about their own security, and they know that Israel is the world leader in high-tech AI cyber warfare. And they want access to that, essentially, to stabilize their regimes. So it's like a corporate takeover, is how the Saudis envision Israel. So with Iran weakened, the Saudis can move closer to Israel, and also with Iran weakened, Netanyahu now has the political ability, which he did not have before, to eventually end the war in Gaza and open negotiations, get the hostages back, the remaining 50 hostages back. All this is more possible after the war than before the war. But the Saudis are the big winners at this point, though they'll never say so. They're very, very, very shrewd. Let me move on to Asia and then close up with Donald Trump, which everybody is interested in. I mean, I don't know why, but they are. Asia. So far I've described wars in the Middle East and in Europe, in Ukraine, because Ukraine is part of core Europe, essentially. It's been impressive the way that financial markets have successfully adapted and priced in the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East. If any of you have bank accounts, you own stocks, you have retirement accounts, you own mutual funds or whatever, you will notice very little difference. You look at your monthly bank statement and it's not much change because of the wars in the Middle East and Ukraine. But if there was a war in the Western Pacific between the world's two largest economies, the United States and China, that involved the most important sea lines of communication for trade, and which disrupted to a much greater degree than Ukraine or the Middle East supply chains, disrupted Taiwan, which produces most of the world's microprocessors. There would be devastating worldwide financial consequences to that. So the Middle East and Ukraine cannot change the world as we experience it. We can argue about it, have discussions about it, but it doesn't change the world so far as we experience it. It changes it in indirect ways. European defense budgets will be higher, so taxes will be higher. That affects you. But that all can be adapted to. But as I said, a war in the Western Pacific has the potential to be like World War I, where it would change our lives so dramatically that we would never be the same again afterwards, as with World War I. But ironically, both Beijing and Washington know all this. They never talk about it, but they know it. And because they know it, this is what helps them to avoid a war in the first place. Remember, Europe was at peace throughout the Cold War for 44 years. That was because of the fear of atomic bombs. And it is the fear of financial collapse that essentially keeps the peace in the Western Pacific. Again, I talked about using your imagination, about imagining a new Iran, imagining a post-Putin Russia. We should use our imagination when talking about China as well. China has been a different China depending upon who the leader has been. It was revolutionary anarchy during Mao Zedong. It was an enlightened, risk-averse, collegial, semi-capitalistic, authoritarian regime under Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. And now it's back to being a Leninist autocracy under Xi Jinping. At some point, Xi will pass from the scene. And Xi's Leninism, his extreme, the most extreme form of communism, may be the last phase of communism in China's history. Remember, China has had dynasties for 5,000 years. And communism may turn out to be just one dynasty in China's history. And China will go on and be very different, and that may eventually heal the division between the United States and China. What keeps the conflict between the United States and China going? What keeps it going is a number of things. There's military. The Chinese see the South China Sea the way the Americans saw the Caribbean at the turn of the 20th century, as a blue water extension of their continental landmass, essentially. Obviously, the American Navy sees it much differently. The American Navy sees the Pacific, the Asia Pacific, as its home waters. Going back to 1853, when the American Commodore Matthew Perry opened Japan to world trade, America fought the Philippine War in 1899. There was World War II in the Pacific. There was Korea and Vietnam, all of which made the Pacific home waters for the United States Navy. Then there's cyber, which I mentioned before. Cyber may be a good thing in terms of financial markets and education, but it's a negative in terms of geopolitics, because it means that China and America are not thousands of miles away. They're one click away through cyber attacks that each conduct upon the other. There's trade, which you all know about with the whole issue of tariffs that Trump wants to impose. And finally, there's ideology. Remember, when China was, as I said, a moderate, risk-averse, collegial regime under Deng Xiaoping, and the United States was continuing as a normal, moderate mass democracy, China and America were actually close. For about 35 years, Communist China had friends in Washington. It had friends in the White House, friends in Congress, friends in the media. That era is gone. China has become a hardcore communist regime again, and the United States now has a radical, populist, right-wing Republican regime. So the gulf, the ideological gulf, is very, very far apart. And that contributes to the distrust, to the complete distrust between the two sides. And remember the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis scared both superpowers because they saw the real possibility of a nuclear war. So after the Cuban Missile Crisis, you had all these peace initiatives. You had a hotline established between Soviet and American leaders. You had détente, nuclear test ban treaty. Both the Kremlin and Washington built borders to stabilize the Cold War. China and America still have not had their Cuban Missile Crisis. They're building towards it. Finally, let me say some things about President Trump. All right. President Trump is what I call the revenge of globalization. Globalization was supposed to unite the world, but it didn't really do that in Western democracies. What it did was split countries right up the middle between what I call a cosmopolitan, wine-sipping, upper middle class, expensive vacation, or multilingual class of Americans, which was about 50% of the country, and another 50% who were resentful, left behind, could not compete in the global world, and who elected Donald Trump, essentially. We saw this with Brexit in Britain. This split, this division in society, is an issue in several European countries, in France and Hungary, especially. You can go around in Holland certainly, with the Geert Wilders movement, so that globalization has divided in the middle your Western societies, drawing half of the populations into this dynamic, impressive global world and leaving the other half deserted, so to speak. And it's the deserted half that elected Donald Trump. That's number one. People ask me, is Trump a fascist? And I laugh. I say, Trump is not serious enough to be a fascist. He doesn't have an attention span. He doesn't have a program. He doesn't read. Remember, Mussolini was a journalist. People forget this. Fascists are like this. They're one-directed. Trump loses interest in issues. He promulgated, he announced this independent Liberation Day tariff program in early April. And then when the financial markets collapsed, two of his other advisors came to him and said, you have to reverse this somewhat. So he reversed it. And the market went up 2,000 points because he was losing interest by that point. So Trump is what I call post-literate. Not illiterate, but post-literate. He can read a smartphone. He can read messages. He can send out tweets, but he's never read a book. He's basically uneducated. Now, think of this. So why does he want Greenland and he doesn't care about Europe? It's because he's post-literate. He's a real estate guy. So he looks at maps and, he's very visual. And he looks at the map of North America and he sees we could get Canada, we can get Greenland, which is right next to Canada, and we can take back the Panama Canal, and we can have a greater North America. But Europe doesn't really interest him, because to understand the historic relationship between the United States and Europe, you need to read, because World War II ended 80 years ago. That's a long time in history. That's a very long time in history. Nothing goes on forever. So nobody should be surprised about the fact that the alliance is in danger now. But Trump can't remember 80 years ago. Of course, none of us can. We really know about the beginning of NATO and the beginning of, the European-American alliance through teaching, through books, things. Trump knows nothing of this. It means, he has no interest in Europe and NATO. All right, he said, the Secretary General of NATO allowed Trump to spend a night with the King and Queen of Holland. Trump was flattered, and now he likes NATO. That will last 2 weeks, essentially. So that's where we are. I'll just close up again with imagination. if any of you have read Tolstoy's War and Peace, there's a character towards the end of the book, a Count Raspachin, who was able to analyze the fact that his analysis told him that Napoleon could indeed invade Moscow, this was 1812, and could conquer Moscow and could burn down and destroy parts of the city. He knew that analytically, but he couldn't imagine it. You know, it was something so unbelievable he couldn't imagine. So when it actually happened, he was as lost as anyone. He was as surprised as anyone because he couldn't see the thing. So in geopolitics, use your imagination. Nobody could imagine an Iran after the Shah until it happened. And right now, nobody can imagine an Iran after the Ayatollahs until it happens. Nobody can imagine a Russia after Putin, a China after Xi. But all these things will probably occur in our lifetime or soon after our deaths. They will happen, and they will dramatically affect geopolitics. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kaplan, for such an interesting lecture. Now, if you want, we can open a debate with the audience, but let me start by asking one question. You talk about China, United States, and the ideological factor. And you said that the Asia and the Pacific has the potential to change the world. And yes, there's common idea that a conflict between China and the United States can lead us to a major war. But maybe there's another possible scenario in which the United States and China, they're ideologically different, but they both speak the same language, I think, at some point, the language of power, of big powers, and the language of, national interest and pragmatism. So there's maybe another scenario in which they both can reach agreements and divide up the world. So the U.S. can take Greenland and the Panama Canal, and China can take Taiwan. So do you think this is a possible scenario? How do you see the European Union in this scenario? Thank you.
Yes, it's all possible. You could almost say it's all likely. Again, I said what's preventing war, though, is not a desire for peace, but fear. And it's the fear of economic catastrophe. You know, fear can be a good thing. Fear can prevent wars much more than optimism can. People say I'm a pessimist, and I say pessimists kill less people than optimists, So yes, this is certainly possible. Remember, China and the United States deal in a world of power and interest. Europe has had its defense budget subsidized by the United States for 80 years. So, Europe can bring up issues like international law, which you never hear about outside of Europe, because Europe does not really deal in a world of power for 80 years. Now it's starting to. With the Ukraine war, it's starting to. And that will change things. That already is changing things. But I think the European Union can matter significantly, number one, if it dramatically builds up its defense forces and finds a way, and this will be very difficult, of managing to trade and get rich off China while at the same time being close to the United States. It's not going to be close to the United States unless, as I said, to repeat, it dramatically raises its defense budgets, because there'll be no support from American taxpayers unless it does. In 2011, 14 years ago, Defense Secretary Robert Gates, who was then working for a liberal pro-European Democratic President Barack Obama warned Europe that if it did not very dramatically raise its defense budgets, the American people would stop supporting it in years to come. And Europe just shrugged. It did nothing. And the result is partly Donald Trump, essentially. So, yes, Europe can matter in this great power struggle between the United States and China.
Thank you. So we can open a debate from the audience. Yes.
Yeah, do you want to...
Yes.
Yeah, you
can
field the
ask.
questions, yeah.
I wanted to ask you about the conflict that's emerging between autocracies and democracies, it seems.
What? Can you talk louder, please?
I wanted to ask about the conflict that seems that it's emerging between democracies and autocracies, and the strengths and weaknesses of each. They say that autocracies can plan long term, but they're also vulnerable to echo chambers and following bad plans. Democracies are better at war, but can have but democracies can have.
Yeah, I heard you. So.
And everything. So, what's your view of the conflict?
Yeah, as you said, autocracies are better at long-term planning. Democracies don't think beyond 4-year election cycles. I think that this is very interesting because in Western democracies have lasted a few hundred years, whereas autocracy and monarchy has lasted for thousands and thousands of years. Western democracy is an experiment. It still is an experiment. And a few cautions. Democracy could not save the Weimar Republic from Hitler, ultimately. So democracies are not perfect, and you can have bad outcomes from democracy. Democracy, like any system, depends on the integrity of the people involved in it. You could look, what I see in the United States now is that the system of checks and balances between the White House, the Congress, and the court, which is really the heart of the American system and what makes it great, is being severely challenged by the Trump administration. So that even democracies are not safe, if you know what I mean. They always have to be worked at. Autocracies are Hungary, to a lesser extent Serbia, have become what I call democratic autocracies. They have elections, but they're run in an autocratic manner. And that's because the Democrats, same with Georgia in the Caucasus, the same with Azerbaijan. Georgia and Azerbaijan started out after the collapse of the Soviet Union as democracies. And the democracies in each place failed. They failed miserably. And what came about in both countries in different ways was a new form of authoritarianism. And both countries are now prospering economically. And they're being well run and well managed. So it's not enough to vote every 4 years. You have to be able to manage institutions well. And but I can see there's a real crisis of democracy, which has been caused, I think, by this splits in turn caused by globalization.
Maybe we can take 2 or 3 questions.
No, I prefer
okay.
one at a time,
Okay.
because then I'll forget, Yeah.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Kaplan, for coming here. It's an honor. I'd like to keep it here in Spain. As you are aware, our president is the only one in the NATO summit who has claimed that Spain is not going to reach the 5% threshold. My question is, should that happen and Spain not invest 5% of its GDP in defense, what would be the consequences, mainly with respect to the United States, for Spain in terms of trade, but also I'm thinking about the autonomous cities, Ceuta and Melilla. Should a conflict arise, for instance, between Spain and Morocco for these cities, what would be the position of the United States?
Yeah, Spain's geography is different than the geography of Poland. Poland is directly threatened by Russia. And so for Poland, which I think its defense budget is like 8% now or higher, Poland, Germany, the Baltic countries, Scandinavia, Russia's next door. So 5% makes sense and is probably too little, in fact. Spain, one could argue, cares more about, sees security not so much in terms of a threat from Russia, but in terms of the whole issue of migration from sub-Saharan Africa, from the greater Middle East, and places like that. And you don't fight migration through buying more tanks, and fighter jets. So I think the Spanish attitude is ultimately rooted in geography. And, it's all right, Italy also is threatened by migration, but it has a right-wing populist government, which has been helpful to President Trump. I can partially understand the Spanish position in this. But on the other hand, Spain is a member of an alliance. And if you want the alliance to be serious and to be taken seriously and to continue to be led and supported by the United States, there are things you have to do. They may not benefit you directly. They may be somewhat inconvenient, but you have to do it. My fear is not just Spain. It's that a number of these countries that agreed to 5% will not carry through, because this 5% deal was agreed upon by democracies, and democracies have national parliaments. And the parliaments can say, oh, wait a minute, maybe 5% over 10 years, or we'll give some of the money to schools and roads. After all, that's defense too, which of course it isn't, but they can argue that it is. So we'll see where this 5% goes. I mean, if all the other countries are serious about raising their defense budgets 5%, that'll matter. That will mean a great difference. But if they're not, and Spain will eventually comply, but if they're not, the whole system could, NATO could unravel, kind of.
Hi, thank you very much, Mr. Kaplan, because your conference was really interesting. But I was wondering of three things. The first one is, can you imagine that Russia can invade other European country in short term? Because we are speaking about imagination in this era. Another one is, can you imagine that a third world war is possible in a short term or in a long term? I don't know. And also, I would like to point the question about how can be the consequence of increasing military expenditure, not just for democracies, but also for welfare state in the European countries, because perhaps there will be a debate about it in many countries such as Spain. And the point is, geopolitics can have consequences for social instability in the European countries. What do you think?
Yes, I'm not worried about Putin invading Europe, Poland and NATO countries. I think he thought he would gain an easy victory over Ukraine 3.5 years ago. He's having so much trouble in Ukraine, I don't see him contemplating an invasion of Europe. What could happen, you could argue, is you could have like a Russian movement, incursion into part of Estonia or Lithuania or Latvia, and the Russians would claim they were defending the Russian minority there, you know? And then you could have a real situation where it wasn't clear if Article 5 of NATO was violated or it wasn't. I could see him trying something like that. But I think if he did that, the sanctions on Russia would double. You know, they would starve out Russia. I mean, it would, it would isolate Russia even more, and I think the Chinese would be against it. You know, that's the thing, because the Chinese find the war in Ukraine convenient for them, because it weakens Russia, which China wants, you know, which China likes, but it doesn't weaken it so much that it collapses. Because China does not want a collapsed Russia. China does not want to be governing small towns in Siberia. So that I think basically Putin is so overwhelmed with Ukraine that contemplating an invasion of NATO proper is off the table for now.
One last question. Yes.
Good morning, Mr. Kaplan. It's been a real pleasure to listen to you in first hand after reading you for years. I wanted to reflect with you that sometimes we forget in Europe that the US wasn't always so interested in an independent military power in Europe. I think we lately we always say, and it's true, that Europe is indebted to the US umbrella, etc. But we have to remember that in key moments, for instance, when France got the bomb, the nuclear bomb, and the US opposed to the unified command, and in the 90s there are other examples of the European logistics for the Balkans, etc. So we forget that. And I wanted to connect this with what you just said that resonated with me about China, Russia, US, these great current powers, military powers in the world, and how the Ukrainian war affects them. Because I'm somehow of the belief that there is a sort of understanding among, or that's my intuition about between the Chinese and in the US and the Americans about Russia, in the sense that yes, of course, China is benefiting from a weak Russia in terms of cheap energy and exports, but also the US is also winning sort of again this big power over the Europeans that hang on the US support. And I believe both, like the US supporting Ukraine on a need basis and just enough to survive, and China doing a similar thing, I will say, providing drones, technology, but and not just under the radar, not to annoy too much everyone else. It's difficult for me not to see that there might be a sort of interest, and remembering the history, right, how World War II actually ended with the Russians invading this northern Siberian China. So it's hard for me to believe couldn't be there an entente also for an after war.
Thank you. Keep in mind that Russia is a nuclear power, and not just a nuclear power. It has enough nuclear weapons, for instance, to destroy the United States in 30 minutes, basically. That was the real key behind President Biden's limited response to helping Ukraine. He was afraid of a catastrophic defeat of Russia that would lead President Putin to maybe use nuclear weapons. It's like what I said earlier, countries with nuclear weapons people deal very respectfully with. So I think the Biden administration acted the way it did by limiting support for Ukraine out of fear. You know, it was fear that motivated it, basically. And the Chinese are already demographically and in terms of trade taking over the Russian Far East and Siberia. Because remember, those are very low populated areas. China has, 1.3 billion people. But if you go to Siberia and the Russian Far East, there's nobody there, But there is gold and timber and diamonds and minerals and all these things that the Chinese want and want to be able to exploit. So China is not Russia's friend, in the long run. It has a tactical alliance with Russia, but is not really a strategic alliance, despite the press releases and the announcements at summit meetings.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kaplan. It's been an honor for us to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been an honor for me too. Thank you.